I was adjusting the clasp on my grandmother's vintage watch when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The name on the screen made my stomach drop. Marcus Reed. My lawyer never called on a Friday night unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. I reached for it with hands that had suddenly forgotten how steady they usually were, and his voice came through before I could even say hello. Jordan, we need to talk now. Don't go to that picnic tomorrow. Your sister filed an injunction this afternoon. She's claiming fraud and trying to block the sale. The words hit like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the granite countertop to keep myself upright. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The strawberry pie I'd spent 3 hours baking sat cooling on the wire rack beside me, its lattice crust golden and perfect, meant as a peace offering for my father who always requested it at our summer gatherings. The entire thing suddenly looked absurd, a relic from a version of reality that had just evaporated. I thought about tomorrow's picnic at Willow Creek Park, about my sister's text from 2 days ago suggesting we arrive early to help set up, about how I'd actually believed we were finally moving past years of tension. Instead, she'd been preparing to destroy me. The morning had started with such ordinary hope. I'd woken up in my loft in the Alberta Arts District with sunlight streaming through the tall windows, turning everything warm and gold. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about cap tables or due diligence or the 1,000 microscopic details that went into selling a company. I was thinking about family, about the fact that my parents had actually sounded pleased when I told them about the Titan Edge acquisition, about how even Victoria had seemed genuinely happy for me during our last phone call. She'd said all the right things, asked all the appropriate questions about the timeline and the terms, laughed when I admitted I still couldn't quite believe it was real. 7 years of 18-hour days and missed holidays and relationships that withered from neglect. All of it finally crystallizing into something tangible. $200 million. The number still didn't feel real when I said it out loud, but it represented more than money. It represented validation, proof that I hadn't been foolish to walk away from the corporate job everyone expected me to take, evidence that my instincts about the market had been correct when every advisor told me I was too early or too ambitious or too naive. I'd driven to the bakery supply store on Hawthorne to get the specific vanilla extract my father preferred, the kind that came in the small glass bottles with the faded labels. I'd picked through containers of strawberries at the farmer's market until I found ones that were perfectly ripe, but still firm enough to hold their shape when baked. These small rituals felt important, like I was rebuilding something that had been carefully dismantled over the past few years. My relationship with Victoria had always been complicated, marked by an undercurrent of competition that neither of us openly acknowledged but both of us felt in every interaction. She was older by 3 years and had established herself early as the successful one, the Blake daughter who did everything right. Columbia for undergrad, Harvard for her MBA, a position at a prestigious consulting firm where she made partner by 32. My parents had framed her achievements like merit badges, displaying them prominently in conversations with friends and relatives. And I had been the other one, the kid who was smart enough but lacked direction, who changed majors twice and graduated with a degree in computer science that I barely used in any conventional sense. When I started Nexus Analytics in a converted warehouse space with 2 college friends and a maxed-out credit card, Victoria's response had been a patronizing smile and a comment about how everyone needs to get the entrepreneurial phase out of their system. My parents had been more direct in their concern, asking repeatedly when I planned to look for a real job, reminding me that the economy was unpredictable, and that I was throwing away my best earning years on a risky venture that would probably fail like most startups do. I'd listened to these assessments and felt the familiar weight of being underestimated, of being loved in that abstract familial way that doesn't quite translate into belief or support. So I stopped talking about the company at family dinners. I stopped mentioning the clients we were signing or the revenue milestones we were hitting. I let them assume it was a hobby that would eventually run its course, and I poured everything I had into proving them wrong in a way that wouldn't require their approval. The watch on my wrist had belonged to my grandmother, my father's mother, who died when I was 15. She'd been a public school teacher for 40 years, the kind of woman who kept immaculate records and showed up early to everything and believed that discipline was a form of love. I'd inherited her methodical nature, her tendency to create systems and track patterns, her inability to leave problems unsolved. The watch was a Timex from the 70s, nothing fancy or valuable, But she'd worn it every day and it still kept perfect time. I put it on this morning thinking about continuity, about honoring the people who came before while building something new. Now it felt like a talisman against whatever was coming, a reminder that I came from people who endured. The pie had taken longer than I expected, partly because I was out of practice with pastry, and partly because I kept getting distracted by emails from the legal team handling the acquisition. Everything was supposed to close on July 15th, just over 2 weeks away. Titan Edge Solutions had been courting us for 8 months, ever since their VP of Strategic Development saw our presentation at a conference in Austin and realized we'd solved a data integration problem their engineers had been struggling with for years. The negotiations had been intense but fair, and I'd felt genuine excitement about what the partnership could mean, not just financially but in terms of scale and impact. Our software helped hospitals analyze patient outcomes and identify intervention points before conditions became critical. With Titan Edge's resources and distribution network, we could expand from the 40 hospitals currently using our platform to potentially thousands. The work mattered, and the sale wasn't an exit strategy so much as an acceleration of the mission. Victoria had called me 3 weeks ago, right after the announcement went out to our investors and board members. She'd sounded warmer than she had in years, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm as she congratulated me and asked questions about the structure of the deal. We'd talked for almost an hour, longer than any conversation we'd had since our grandmother's funeral. She wanted to know about the retention bonuses for key employees, about whether I planned to stay on in a leadership role or step away entirely, about how I was handling the emotional complexity of letting go of something I'd built from nothing. I'd felt something loosen in my chest during that call, a tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Maybe this success would finally dissolve the invisible hierarchy that had defined our relationship. Maybe she could see me as a peer now instead of her underachieving younger sibling, who needed guidance and correction. She'd even suggested the picnic, framing it as a celebration. "Let's do the summer gathering at Willow Creek like we used to," she'd texted. "You deserve to have the family acknowledge what you've accomplished." I'd read those words multiple times, looking for sarcasm or hidden barbs, but they seemed sincere. So I'd agreed, and I'd offered to bring the strawberry pie, and I'd allowed myself to imagine a version of tomorrow where my parents looked at me with uncomplicated pride and Victoria raised a glass in a toast that didn't carry any undertones of rivalry or resentment. I'd imagine my nephew asking me questions about how computers work and my brother-in-law Derek actually engaging in conversation instead of checking his phone. I'd imagine feeling like I belonged in my own family. The kitchen in my loft smelled like butter and fruit and caramelized sugar, and I'd been thinking about what to wear tomorrow, whether to keep it casual or acknowledge the significance of the moment with something slightly more formal. I'd been thinking about whether to bring printouts of press coverage to share or if that would seem like bragging. I'd been thinking like someone who still believed her family operated in good faith, and the naivety of it made me feel physically ill now that Marcus's words were still echoing in my ears. "Your sister filed an injunction. She's claiming fraud, trying to block the sale." I made myself breathe slowly and deliberately, the way my old therapist had taught me during the early days of the company when the stress felt like it might crack me open. Marcus was still talking, his voice steady but urgent, explaining that Victoria had submitted a filing claiming I'd misrepresented company financials to inflate the sale price, that I'd hidden liabilities and overstated our client retention rates, that the entire deal was built on fraudulent projections designed to enrich myself at the expense of other stakeholders. The accusations were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be hard to disprove quickly. She'd timed it perfectly, filing late on a Friday afternoon when courts were closing and everyone involved in the acquisition would be unreachable until Monday. The goal was clearly to create chaos and doubt, to make Titan Edge question whether they'd done adequate due diligence, to introduce enough uncertainty that they might walk away from the deal entirely. I asked Marcus how this was possible, how Victoria would even have standing to file such a claim when she had no ownership stake in Nexus Analytics and no formal connection to the company. His pause told me the answer was worse than I'd anticipated. "She's claiming whistleblower status," he said carefully. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. She's stating that she became aware of the fraud through family conversations and felt morally obligated to come forward. She's also submitted testimony from your parents corroborating that you discussed the sale in ways that suggested you were aware the numbers were inflated. My vision actually blurred for a second, the kitchen tilting sideways before I forced it back into focus. My parents. They were backing her claim, providing statements that would be used to destroy me in court and torpedo the biggest achievement of my professional life. I thought about every dinner where I'd carefully avoided discussing specifics about the company, because I knew it made them uncomfortable when I talked about anything they couldn't immediately understand or categorize. I thought about the handful of times I had shared details, usually when pressed, trying to help them grasp the scope of what we were building. I'd shown them charts and metrics, walked them through client testimonials, explained the validation process that confirmed our accuracy rates. I'd done this not to brag but to bridge the gap, to give them a window into my world so they might understand why I'd chosen this path. And apparently every word had been cataloged and weaponized, twisted into evidence of fraud by the people who were supposed to protect me. Marcus was asking if I could come to his office tonight, saying we needed to start building a defense immediately, but I was still stuck on the image of my family sitting around a table strategizing about how to destroy me. Had they planned this during Sunday dinners while I was working late at the office? Had they rehearsed their statements together, making sure their stories aligned? The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that I couldn't find the edges of it, couldn't identify where legitimate concern might have twisted into malice. I heard myself tell Marcus I'd be there in 30 minutes, and then I was moving through the apartment on autopilot, pulling on jeans and a sweater, grabbing my laptop bag, checking that I had my keys and wallet. The strawberry pie sat on the counter, perfect and pointless, and I had a wild impulse to throw it against the wall just to watch it explode into a mess of fruit and crust and wasted effort. Instead, I covered it with foil and put it in the refrigerator, which felt like an even more pathetic response, preserving something that would never be eaten for a gathering that would never happen. I caught my reflection in the darkened window above the sink, and the woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger, someone foolish enough to believe that success could erase years of casual dismissal and calculated undermining. The watch on my wrist caught the light, its second hand ticking forward with relentless consistency, and I made myself focus on that steady progression. Time was still moving. The world hadn't actually ended. I just had to figure out how to keep standing in it. The drive to Marcus Reed's office in the Pearl District normally took 15 minutes, but traffic was backed up from an accident on the Burnside Bridge, and I sat in my car watching the brake lights ahead of me glow red in the gathering dusk. My hands were clenched around the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles ached, and I kept replaying Marcus's words in my head, trying to make them mean something different than what they clearly meant. She's claiming whistleblower status. Your parents corroborated. The phrases looped endlessly, each repetition driving the reality deeper into my consciousness until I couldn't pretend I'd misunderstood or that there was some reasonable explanation waiting to smooth everything over. I'd built Nexus Analytics with 2 other founders, both of whom had moved on to different ventures after we secured Series B funding 3 years ago. They'd wanted to cash out their equity and pursue other opportunities, and I'd bought them out using a combination of investor capital and personal loans that had taken me 2 years to fully repay. The company was mine in every sense that mattered, legally and practically, and I'd steered it through expansion phases and market downturns, and the countless small crises that define startup life. Every financial statement had been audited by external firms. Every projection had been stress tested by analysts who got paid specifically to find holes in optimistic assumptions. The idea that I'd somehow fabricated numbers or misrepresented our position was so absurd that I couldn't even begin to construct a defense against it, because the premise itself defied reality. But that was the insidious genius of Victoria's approach. She wasn't claiming I'd committed obvious fraud that could be easily disproven. She was suggesting a pattern of subtle inflation, of massaging figures just enough to create a misleading picture without technically lying. It was the kind of accusation that required extensive documentation to refute, that would force us to open every aspect of our financials to scrutiny and justify every projection and assumption. Even if we proved conclusively that nothing improper had occurred, the process would take weeks or months, and Titan Edge would be long gone by then. They were a public company with shareholders and quarterly earnings calls, and a pristine reputation to maintain. The whiff of controversy around an acquisition would be enough to make them walk away, regardless of whether the accusations had any merit. Traffic finally started moving, and I merged onto the bridge, the Willamette River dark and smooth below me. I'd chosen Portland deliberately when I was deciding where to establish the company, drawn by the combination of tech infrastructure and lower costs compared to San Francisco or Seattle. I'd wanted to build something outside the traditional startup ecosystem, to prove that innovation didn't require proximity to Sand Hill Road. The city had been good to me in ways that went beyond business metrics. I'd found a community here, people who understood what it meant to pour yourself into something that might fail, who celebrated small victories because they knew how hard won they were. I had friends who would show up at my apartment with takeout when I was too exhausted to cook, who understood when I had to cancel plans because a client crisis couldn't wait, who asked thoughtful questions about the work itself rather than just the potential payout. None of those people were related to me by blood, and I felt the weight of that distinction now in a way I'd never allowed myself to fully acknowledge. My family had always existed in a separate category, people I loved out of obligation and history rather than genuine connection. We performed the rituals of closeness, exchanged gifts at holidays and showed up for milestone events, but there was no real intimacy underneath the surface interactions. I couldn't remember the last time I'd called my mother just to talk, or the last time my father had asked me a question about my life that went deeper than surface pleasantries. Victoria and I had been competitors since childhood, locked in an unspoken contest that she'd been winning for decades until suddenly she wasn't anymore. And I'd been naive enough to think that my success might change the dynamic, might allow us to relate to each other as equals rather than adversaries. Marcus's office was in a renovated industrial building that still had the original brick walls and exposed ductwork. I'd hired him 4 years ago when we were negotiating our first major client contract and needed someone who understood both technology licensing and corporate law. He was in his mid-50s, methodical and unflappable, the kind of lawyer who spoke in measured tones and never made promises he couldn't keep. His assistant had already left for the day, and the reception area was dark except for the ambient light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see Marcus through the glass wall of his office, hunched over his desk with papers spread in front of him, and something about his posture told me the situation was even worse than I'd understood from our phone call. He looked up when I knocked, and his expression confirmed my assessment. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "I need to walk you through exactly what your sister filed, and then we need to talk about response strategy." I sat down, placing my bag on the floor beside me, and waited for him to organize his thoughts. Marcus was the kind of person who presented information in logical sequence, building arguments brick by brick, and I knew better than to rush him. He slid a document across the desk toward me, and I recognized the header from court filings I'd reviewed during various corporate legal matters. Petition for temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, it read, and below that, Victoria Blake versus Jordan Blake and Nexus Analytics LLC. Seeing my own name in that context felt surreal, like reading about a character in a story rather than my own life. Marcus walked me through the filing page by page, his voice steady as he translated legal language into plain English. Victoria was claiming that I'd systematically misrepresented Nexus Analytics' financial position to Titan Edge Solutions during acquisition negotiations. Specifically, she alleged that I'd inflated our monthly recurring revenue by counting pilot programs as full contracts, that I'd understated our customer churn rate by using deceptive measurement periods, and that I'd hidden significant technical debt that would require millions in additional investment to resolve. Each accusation was accompanied by what she claimed was supporting documentation, though Marcus noted that most of it consisted of her own affidavits rather than actual company records. The truly damaging part was the testimony from my parents. According to their sworn statements, I had discussed the Titan Edge acquisition during multiple family dinners, and had made comments suggesting I was aware the financial projections were optimistic to the point of being misleading. My father claimed I'd said something along the lines of, "They're buying the story more than the numbers," which he interpreted as an admission that the underlying metrics didn't support the valuation. My mother stated that I'd seemed anxious and evasive when asked direct questions about client retention, which she took as evidence of guilty knowledge. Neither of these recollections bore any resemblance to conversations I actually remembered having, but they were specific enough to sound credible, and they came from people who theoretically had no motive to lie about their own daughter. I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest as Marcus continued his analysis. This wasn't just a legal attack. It was character assassination, an attempt to paint me as fundamentally dishonest and incompetent. Victoria had constructed a narrative in which I was a desperate founder willing to commit fraud to secure a payout I didn't deserve, someone whose own parents had observed troubling behavior and felt compelled to support whistleblower claims. The timing was calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum opportunity for response. By filing late Friday, she'd ensured that TitanEdge's leadership would spend the entire weekend wondering if they'd been conned, that their lawyers would be drafting memos about liability exposure, that their board would be questioning whether to proceed with the acquisition at all. Marcus finished his explanation and sat back in his chair, watching me with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was assessing my stability. "How are you holding up?" he asked, and the gentleness in his voice almost broke something in me. I wanted to scream or cry or put my fist through the glass wall of his office, but instead, I took a slow breath and forced myself to think strategically rather than emotionally. "What do we do?" I asked. "What's the actual process from here?" He nodded, appreciating that I was asking practical questions instead of dissolving into panic. "We have until Wednesday to file our response," he said. "That means we have 4 days to gather every piece of documentation that proves your financial statements were accurate, to get affidavits from your auditors and investors confirming proper due diligence, to build a paper trail that contradicts every single one of her accusations." 4 days. The timeline felt simultaneously too short and agonizingly long. I thought about the team at Nexus Analytics, the 37 employees who'd put their faith in my leadership, and who were probably going to spend their weekend reading news articles about fraud allegations against their CEO. I thought about the investors who'd backed us through multiple funding rounds, who'd be getting calls from their limited partners asking if they'd been aware of any irregularities. I thought about the hospitals using our software to make critical care decisions, and whether they'd lose confidence in our product because of questions about the integrity of the company behind it. The damage was already spreading, metastasizing through every network I'd spent years building, and we hadn't even begun to fight back yet. Marcus was pulling up files on his computer, creating a task list of documents we'd need to compile, and people we'd need to contact. I watched him work and felt a strange disconnection from my own body, as if I was observing this scene from outside myself. The rational part of my brain understood that we had a strong case, that the truth was on our side and we had evidence to prove it. But another part, the part that was still processing the emotional reality of my family's betrayal, couldn't stop fixating on the fact that my own parents had signed statements calling me a fraud. They'd put their names on legal documents asserting that I was dishonest and untrustworthy. They'd chosen Victoria's version of events over mine without apparently even asking me for my perspective. I realized Marcus was asking me a question and I'd completely missed it. "Sorry," I said, forcing myself to focus. "What did you say?" He repeated himself patiently. "I need you to think carefully about any conversations you had with Victoria about the acquisition. Anything she might have taken out of context or misinterpreted. We need to understand what she thinks she knows and where her information came from." I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct the phone call from 3 weeks ago. The one where she'd sounded so warm and supportive. She'd asked detailed questions about the deal structure, about how we'd arrived at the valuation, about what due diligence TitanEdge had conducted. At the time, I'd interpreted her interest as genuine curiosity, maybe even a hint of professional respect. Now I understood she'd been gathering ammunition, collecting information she could twist into evidence of wrongdoing. I told Marcus about the conversation, trying to remember her exact questions and my responses. She'd asked specifically about our revenue recognition policies, about how we categorize different types of client contracts. I'd explained that we followed standard SaaS accounting practices, that everything was reviewed by external auditors, that TitanEdge's financial team had spent months verifying our numbers. I'd been proud of how thorough and transparent the process had been, proud that we'd passed every level of scrutiny with our integrity intact. But Victoria had apparently heard something different in those explanations, or had chosen to interpret them differently, turning my confidence into arrogance and my transparency into evasion. Marcus made notes as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing or specific phrases I'd used. When I finished, he sat back and tapped his pen against his desk in a rhythm that suggested he was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously. "Here's what I think is happening," he said finally. "Your sister isn't actually trying to prove fraud. She's trying to create enough doubt and delay that Titan Edge walks away from the deal. She doesn't need to win in court. She just needs to win in the court of public opinion and corporate risk assessment. If she can make this messy enough, expensive enough, time-consuming enough, then she achieves her goal even if every allegation is eventually disproven. The clarity of his assessment was almost comforting in its grimness. At least I understood the game now, understood that this wasn't about truth or justice but about sabotage and destruction. But understanding the strategy didn't tell me why Victoria wanted to destroy me in the first place. What did she gain from tanking the acquisition? We weren't competing for the same resources or recognition anymore. My success didn't diminish hers in any objective sense. Unless that was exactly the problem. Unless after 34 years of being the accomplished Blake daughter, she couldn't tolerate the idea of me surpassing her, of my achievements becoming the central narrative in our family's story. I said as much to Marcus, and he nodded slowly. Motivations matter for building our narrative, he said, but they won't be enough to win the case. We need to focus on facts and evidence, on documents that can't be disputed. I need you to go home tonight and write down everything you remember about conversations with your family regarding the company. Dates, locations, who else was present, what was actually said. We'll compare your recollection against their statements and look for contradictions. Meanwhile, I'll start reaching out to your auditing firm and your investors. We need affidavits confirming that your financials were properly vetted and that no irregularities were identified during due diligence. The plan made sense intellectually, but implementing it meant spending the weekend immersed in the mechanics of my own destruction, documenting every way my family had failed me while simultaneously proving I hadn't failed my company. I felt exhausted just thinking about it, but I also felt something else beginning to take shape underneath the exhaustion. Anger, clean and cold and clarifying. Victoria had made a choice when she filed that petition. She'd chosen to try to destroy something I'd built with my own hands. Something that mattered beyond personal ambition or family dynamics. She'd chosen to jeopardize the livelihoods of 37 employees and the potential healthcare outcomes for thousands of patients, all in service of some petty jealousy she couldn't overcome through honest competition. And my parents had chosen to enable her, to provide the veneer of credibility her accusations needed to be taken seriously. Those choices had consequences, and I was going to make sure they understood that. Marcus was still talking, outlining next steps and deadlines, but I was already several moves ahead, thinking about what came after we defeated the injunction. Because we would defeat it. The evidence was on our side, and I had resources Victoria didn't anticipate. I had a company full of people who knew my character and my competence. I had investors who'd watched me navigate crises and deliver results. I had years of documented success that contradicted the narrative she was trying to construct. What I didn't have anymore was any illusion about the nature of my family relationships, and the loss of that illusion was strangely liberating. I left Marcus's office after 10 with a list of tasks and a timeline that would consume my entire weekend. The parking garage was nearly empty, my footsteps echoing off concrete as I walked to my car. The city outside was alive with Friday night energy, people heading to restaurants and bars, couples walking hand in hand toward the waterfront. I'd planned to be at the picnic tomorrow by noon, had imagined myself helping set up tables and playing with my nephew and accepting congratulations with appropriate humility. Instead, I'd be in my apartment surrounded by spreadsheets and legal documents, building a defense against accusations that should never have been necessary to refute. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the meeting with Marcus, and I finally looked at the messages once I was in my car. 3 texts from my mother, each one more insistent than the last. Jordan, we need to talk before tomorrow. Call me when you get this. It's important. I stared at the words, trying to imagine what conversation she thought we needed to have. Was she planning to warn me about the injunction, pretending she wasn't part of it? Was she going to offer some gentle counsel about accepting that the sale wasn't meant to be, about how everything happens for a reason? The presumption that I would still show up tomorrow, still play my assigned role in their family theater, was almost impressive in its audacity. I didn't call her back. Instead, I started the car and pulled out of the garage, heading toward my apartment with no intention of sleeping anytime soon. The work ahead of me was massive and urgent, but I felt a strange clarity settling over me as I drove through the quiet streets. My grandmother's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, marking time that couldn't be recovered or rewound. Victoria had made her move, and now I would make mine. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep the betrayal went, and that meant examining every interaction I'd had with my family over the past 6 months. Somewhere in those conversations was the moment they decided I was expendable, and I was going to find it. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of documentation and revelation. I transformed my dining table into a command center, covering it with printouts and sticky notes and color-coded folders. Marcus had sent over Victoria's complete filing early Saturday morning, and I'd read through it methodically, highlighting every specific claim that needed to be refuted. The document was 53 pages long, dense with legal language and financial terminology, but the underlying message was simple and brutal. Jordan Blake is a fraud who manipulated data to enrich herself, and her own family witnessed the deception firsthand. I started with the easiest accusations to disprove, the ones based on objective financial records. Victoria claimed we'd inflated monthly recurring revenue by counting pilot programs as full contracts. I pulled up our accounting system and generated reports showing exactly how we categorized different contract types. Pilot programs were clearly designated as such, with separate revenue recognition policies that followed generally accepted accounting principles. They were never included in our MRR calculations, and I had email chains with our auditors confirming the appropriate treatment. I compiled everything into a folder and sent it to Marcus with a subject line that read, Accusation 1 refuted. The customer churn claim was slightly more complex but equally disprovable. Victoria alleged that we'd used deceptive measurement periods to hide high attrition rates. In reality, we'd used industry-standard cohort analysis and had provided Titan Edge with raw data showing customer retention across multiple time horizons. I pulled the original presentations we'd given during due diligence, complete with the Titan Edge team's questions and our detailed responses. Their own analysts had verified our methodology and found it conservative rather than aggressive. I added those documents to another folder and kept moving through the list. By Saturday afternoon, I had counter-evidence for every financial accusation Victoria had made. Our technical debt was fully documented and had been disclosed to Titan Edge in writing. Our revenue recognition policies were textbook compliant. Our projections were based on historical growth rates and market analysis, vetted by independent consultants. Every number we'd presented during acquisition negotiations could be traced back to source documentation and third-party verification. The fraud narrative collapsed under the weight of basic scrutiny, which made its existence even more enraging. Victoria had filed accusations she must have known were false, banking on the idea that the process itself would be damaging regardless of the outcome. But the financial documents, while crucial, weren't the hardest part of building our defense. The truly difficult work was confronting my parents' testimony and understanding how they'd arrived at interpretations that bore so little resemblance to reality. I forced myself to read their statements multiple times, looking past my emotional reaction to analyze what they were actually claiming. My father's testimony centered on a dinner that happened in mid-May, about 6 weeks ago. According to his account, I'd been evasive when asked about customer satisfaction scores, had changed the subject when he pressed for details about contract renewals, and had eventually said something he interpreted as an admission that the numbers weren't as strong as we were telling Titan Edge. I remembered that dinner clearly because it had been uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. My parents had invited me over on a Tuesday evening, unusual because they typically reserved weeknight dinners for immediate family. Victoria and Derek had been there, which should have been my first warning that something was off. The conversation had been stilted from the beginning, with long silences and forced pleasantries that felt rehearsed. When my father asked about the acquisition, I tried to explain the complexities of enterprise software sales cycles, how customer satisfaction manifested differently in B2B contexts compared to consumer products. He'd seemed frustrated by my explanation, kept asking for simple yes or no answers to questions that didn't have simple answers. At one point I'd said something like the narrative matters as much as the metrics in these deals, trying to convey that Titan Edge decision was based on strategic value and market position, not just trailing revenue numbers. My father had seized on the word narrative like I'd confessed to something, asking what I meant, whether I was saying the actual numbers didn't support the valuation. I tried to clarify, to explain that of course the numbers supported the valuation, that I was talking about how acquisition decisions incorporate both quantitative and qualitative factors. But the conversation had derailed at that point, with Victoria jumping in to ask increasingly hostile questions about our accounting practices, and my father sitting back with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'd left that dinner feeling unsettled and confused, unclear about what had just happened but certain that something had shifted. Now I understood it had been a setup, a carefully staged conversation designed to create moments they could later reinterpret as admissions of wrongdoing. The phrase, "they're buying the story more than the numbers," which my father claimed I'd said, was close enough to what I'd actually said that I couldn't completely deny it, but the meaning had been inverted. I'd been describing normal acquisition dynamics, not confessing to fraud. The distinction should have been obvious to anyone arguing in good faith, but good faith had apparently left the building long before that dinner took place. My mother's testimony was vaguer but somehow more personally wounding. She claimed I'd seemed anxious and defensive whenever the acquisition came up in conversation, that I'd avoided family gatherings in the weeks leading up to the announcement, that my behavior suggested guilty conscience rather than legitimate stress about a major business transaction. The accusations were impossible to definitively refute because they were based on her subjective interpretation of my emotional state, but they were also completely divorced from reality. I'd avoided some family gatherings because I was working 100-hour weeks trying to finalize the deal, managing due diligence requests while keeping the company running. My anxiety, to the extent it existed, came from the enormous pressure of negotiating the most important transaction of my professional life, not from any awareness of wrongdoing. But my mother had chosen to interpret my behavior through the least generous lens possible, to assume that stress indicated guilt rather than normal human response to high-stakes situations. And she'd put that interpretation in a legal document, sworn under penalty of perjury, knowing it would be used to destroy my reputation and tank the acquisition. I kept trying to find an explanation that didn't require accepting that my own mother would deliberately sabotage me, but the facts wouldn't support any alternative narrative. She'd made a choice, and the choice was clear. By Sunday morning, I had a different kind of clarity about what I was dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. This wasn't a family conflict that could be smoothed over with time and goodwill. This was warfare, and my family had fired the first shot with the full intention of causing maximum damage. The appropriate response wasn't reconciliation. It was total victory followed by complete separation. I didn't need parents who would betray me for reasons I still didn't fully understand. I didn't need a sister whose jealousy was so consuming that she'd commit legal fraud to bring me down. What I needed was to win this fight decisively enough that they never considered trying again. Marcus called Sunday afternoon with news that shifted my perspective entirely. "I've been going through Victoria's filing in detail," he said, "and something wasn't adding up. Some of her accusations include information she shouldn't have access to. Internal financial data, client names for contracts that weren't public, specific details about our technology architecture." I'd been so focused on refuting the accusations that I hadn't stopped to question how Victoria knew enough to make them in the first place. Marcus continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I think someone inside Nexus Analytics has been feeding her information. We need to figure out who and how much they've shared." The implications crashed over me like cold water. Corporate espionage, breach of confidentiality agreements, potential theft of trade secrets. If someone on my team had been passing information to Victoria, the damage went far beyond the current injunction. It meant we had a security problem that could undermine the Titan Edge acquisition, even if we won in court. It meant someone I trusted with access to sensitive systems had violated that trust for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. Marcus was already talking about next steps, about hiring a forensic IT specialist to trace the information leak, but I was thinking about the roster of people with access to the kind of detailed financial and technical data Victoria had referenced in her filing. It was a short list, maybe 8 or 9 people who had administrative access to our accounting systems and technical documentation. I trusted all of them, had worked alongside some of them for years, had promoted others based on their competence and loyalty. The idea that one of them had been systematically betraying the company felt impossible, but the evidence suggested otherwise. I told Marcus to proceed with the forensic investigation and promised to compile a list of people with relevant access levels. Then I sat at my dining table surrounded by the architecture of my defense and felt something that had been holding together finally start to fracture. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that made Portland feel like it was wrapped in gauze. I'd slept maybe 4 hours total over the weekend, sustained by coffee and the grim momentum of crisis management. My apartment looked like a legal war room, every surface covered with documents and laptop screens showing spreadsheets that I'd memorized by now. The forensic IT specialist Marcus had hired was scheduled to arrive at the Nexus Analytics office at 9, which meant I needed to be there early to prepare the team for what was about to happen. I also needed to look them in the eye and figure out which one of them had sold me out. The drive downtown felt surreal. Traffic moved with its usual Monday morning sluggishness, people in adjacent cars sipping coffee and checking their phones, completely unaware that my entire world had detonated over the weekend. I kept the radio off, preferring silence to the cheerful banter of morning show hosts discussing topics that felt like they belonged to a different universe. My grandmother's watch showed 7:45 when I pulled into the parking garage beneath Pioneer Tech Center. The building was mostly empty at this hour, just a few dedicated workaholics and cleaning staff moving through the lobbies and corridors. Nexus Analytics occupied the entire 6th floor, a space we'd expanded into 18 months ago when our headcount grew past 20. I'd been so proud of that expansion, of the ping-pong table and the standing desks and the kitchen area stocked with snacks and kombucha on tap. It had felt like evidence of arrival, proof that we'd graduated from scrappy startup to legitimate company. Now I walked through the space and saw it differently, wondering which desk belonged to the person who'd been feeding information to Victoria, whether they'd felt any hesitation before violating every principle of professional ethics and basic loyalty. My office was in the corner with windows overlooking the river. I'd left my personal items mostly at home over the weekend, working from my apartment to maintain focus, but the space still held traces of normalcy from last Friday. A coffee mug I'd forgotten to wash sat on my desk, the residue dried into a brown ring at the bottom. A stack of resumes for an open engineering position waited in my inbox, candidates who'd applied before the injunction was filed, and who probably wouldn't want the job anymore, once they learned about the legal chaos. I set my bag down and opened my laptop, pulling up the access logs that would show which employees had viewed sensitive financial documents over the past 3 months. The forensic specialist arrived at 8:30, a woman named Kimberly Torres who came recommended by Marcus's firm. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of corporate malfeasance and wasn't easily shocked. We shook hands and I led her to our server room, a climate-controlled space humming with equipment that stored every piece of data Nexus Analytics had ever generated. Kimberly set up her laptop and connected to our network with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving across the keyboard in patterns that looked almost like piano playing. I explained what we were looking for: evidence of unauthorized access to financial records or technical specifications, anything that could have been passed to an outside party. Kimberly nodded as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions about our security protocols and access hierarchies. How many people have administrative privileges, she asked, and I gave her the list I'd compiled over the weekend. 8 employees with varying levels of access, each one someone I'd personally authorized based on their role and responsibilities. Kimberly made notes and promised to have preliminary findings by end of business today. The speed surprised me until I realized that data forensics in the digital age left trails that were much harder to hide than people assumed. The rest of the team started arriving around 9, and I could see the tension immediately. Word had gotten out over the weekend, which was inevitable given that Victoria's filing was a matter of public record and several employees had family members who worked in legal or tech circles. People clustered in small groups near the kitchen area, voices low, conversation stopping abruptly when I walked past. I'd called an all-hands meeting for 10 o'clock to address the situation directly, but the 2 hours beforehand felt like walking through a minefield of worried glances and unasked questions. Elliot Chun found me in my office around 9:30. He was one of our junior IT security analysts, 26 years old and barely 2 years out of college, but sharp in ways that transcended his limited experience. He knocked on my doorframe even though the door was open, hovering uncertainly until I gestured for him to come in. His hands were shaking slightly as he closed the door behind him, and I felt a spike of adrenaline wondering if this was the moment, if the betrayal was about to reveal itself through guilty confession. But what Elliot said wasn't a confession. Miss Blake, he started, then corrected himself. Jordan, I think you should know something. I've been noticing some unusual activity in our access logs over the past few weeks. I flagged it internally but wasn't sure if it was significant enough to escalate. Now with everything that's happened, I think it might be related. He pulled out his phone and showed me a document he'd compiled, timestamps and IP addresses and file access patterns that meant nothing to me but clearly meant something to him. I called Kimberly in from the server room, and she and Elliot bent over the data together, speaking in the technical shorthand of people who understood systems architecture and security protocols. I caught fragments of their conversation, phrases like anomalous login patterns and external network requests, and felt my pulse accelerate as I understood they were finding something concrete. After 10 minutes, Kimberly looked up at me with an expression that managed to combine professional neutrality with genuine surprise. Someone has been systematically accessing your financial database and technical documentation over the past 2 months, she said. The access happened during off hours, mostly late at night or early morning, and the files were being exported to an external drive. Who? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be worse than I'd imagined. Kimberly pulled up an access log entry and pointed to the username. The account belongs to Derek Hammond, my brother-in-law, Victoria's husband, the man who'd sat across from me at family dinners and made small talk about his consulting work, who'd seemed like a pleasant if somewhat distant addition to the family, who apparently had access to Nexus analytics systems despite having no official role with the company. I stared at the screen trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How does Derek have login credentials? I asked Elliot, and he looked uncomfortable. He's listed as an external advisor in our system. The account was created about 18 months ago, authorized by you. I searched my memory and found the interaction he was referencing, a conversation with Derek at a family barbecue where he'd mentioned having experience with data analytics and offered to review some of our processes. I'd been trying to build bridges to find common ground with Victoria's husband, and I'd set him up with limited access to some non-sensitive documentation. Limited being the key word, access that shouldn't have allowed him anywhere near financial records or proprietary technology specifications. Kimberly was already tracking the account's activity history, pulling up a timeline that showed the scope of Derek's intrusion. He'd started with legitimate access to the materials I'd authorized, technical white papers and process documentation that were interesting but not particularly valuable. Then about 3 months ago, his access pattern changed. He started probing other parts of the system, finding security gaps that let him escalate his privileges and reach databases he was never meant to see. It was sophisticated work, the kind that required both technical knowledge and deliberate intent. He knew what he was doing and he knew it was unauthorized, and he'd been careful to cover his tracks by conducting his activities during times when monitoring was less likely to catch anomalies. The timeline aligned perfectly with Victoria's injunction. Derek had been gathering information for months, compiling a dossier of internal data that Victoria could use to make her accusations sound credible and specific. They'd planned this together, husband and wife coordinating their attack with the kind of strategic precision that should have been applied to something productive rather than destructive. I felt physically ill looking at the access logs, seeing the dates and times when Derek had been stealing from my company while presumably sitting in his home office or maybe in my parents' house during one of their Sunday dinners. Elliot was still standing near my desk, looking miserable. I should have escalated this sooner, he said quietly. I saw the unusual patterns but convinced myself it was a monitoring error or a legitimate use case I didn't understand. I didn't want to accuse someone without being certain. I looked at him, this young analyst who'd done exactly what he was supposed to do by flagging potential issues, and who was now beating himself up for not having perfect hindsight. You did nothing wrong, I told him, and meant it. Derek had administrative credentials that made his access look authorized. You identified the anomaly and documented it. That's exactly the right response. Kimberly was printing out the access logs and compiling screenshots of Derek's activity. This is clear-cut unauthorized access, she said. Depending on what he did with the information he exported, you could be looking at criminal charges for corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. She glanced at me to gauge my reaction, and I felt the cold clarity that had been building all weekend crystallize into something harder and sharper. I want a complete forensic report by end of day, I told her. Every file he accessed, every export he made, every security vulnerability he exploited. I want documentation that would hold up in criminal court, not just civil proceedings. The all-hands meeting at 10 was one of the hardest things I'd ever done professionally. I stood in front of 37 people who trusted me to lead the company and told them about the injunction Victoria had filed, about the fraud accusations that were completely baseless, about the fact that we had a corporate security breach that was being addressed. I watched their faces cycle through shock and concern and anger, saw some of them making mental calculations about their stock options and whether they should start looking for new jobs, and I forced myself to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. I told them the truth as I understood it. We have irrefutable evidence that our financial statements are accurate and that no fraud occurred. We have documentation showing that Titan Edge conducted thorough due diligence and found our representations to be conservative rather than aggressive. We are going to defeat this injunction, close the acquisition, and emerge from this situation stronger than we went into it. What I didn't tell them was that my own family had orchestrated the attack, that my brother-in-law had committed federal crimes to gather ammunition for my sister's legal assault. Some details were too personal and too embarrassing to share, even with people who deserved transparency. The questions that followed were exactly what I would have asked in their position. What happens to the Titan Edge deal if the injunction succeeds? Are our jobs at risk? Should we be concerned about working for a company facing fraud allegations? I answered each one as honestly as I could without revealing information that was legally sensitive or strategically unwise. By the time the meeting ended, I could see that most of the team was cautiously optimistic rather than actively panicking, which was the best outcome I could have hoped for under the circumstances. After everyone filtered back to their desks, I returned to my office and found Marcus had sent an email with our court date. Wednesday at 2 p.m., less than 48 hours away. Judge Patricia Holloway presiding, a federal judge with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and limited patience for frivolous litigation. Marcus seemed pleased with the assignment, noting in his email that Holloway was known for examining evidence carefully rather than accepting accusations at face value. That was good news, assuming our evidence was as strong as I believed it was. I spent the rest of Monday afternoon working with Marcus to organize our defense materials. We had binders of financial documentation, affidavits from our external auditors, detailed due diligence reports from Titan Edge's team, and now Kimberly's forensic analysis showing unauthorized access by Derek Hammond. The case we could present was comprehensive and damning, not to my credibility but to Victoria's. She'd filed accusations based on stolen information obtained through criminal activity, and she'd misrepresented that information to make legitimate business practices look fraudulent. But Marcus cautioned against overconfidence. Judges hate family disputes, he reminded me. They tend to assume everyone shares some blame and look for middle ground solutions. We need to make it absolutely clear that this isn't a family squabble that got out of hand. This is attempted corporate sabotage by someone with no legal standing and no legitimate grievance. The distinction mattered because it would determine how Judge Holloway framed the case in her own mind, whether she saw it as siblings fighting over money, or as a clear-cut attempt to interfere with a lawful business transaction through fraudulent means. Tuesday passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Titan Edge's legal team had been copied on Victoria's filing, and had sent a carefully worded email expressing concern and requesting clarification. The subtext was clear enough. They were preparing their exit strategy, drafting the press release that would announce the acquisition was being postponed pending resolution of legal questions. Marcus responded with a memo outlining our evidence and assuring them that the injunction would be defeated swiftly, but I could read between the lines of corporate speak well enough to know we were losing their confidence with each passing hour. I tried calling my mother Tuesday evening, breaking my self-imposed silence because I needed to understand if there was any possibility of resolution before we entered a courtroom and made this conflict permanently irreparable. She answered on the third ring, her voice careful and measured. "Jordan, I'm glad you called. We've been worried about you." The "we" in that sentence told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay, but I pushed forward anyway. "Mom, I need to know if you understand what Victoria is actually doing. She's not protecting the family or looking out for my best interests. She's trying to destroy my company using information that was stolen through criminal activity." There was a long pause, and I could hear my father's voice in the background asking who was on the phone. When my mother spoke again, her tone had shifted to something I recognized from childhood. The voice she used when she'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed by argument or emotion. Your sister is concerned about your judgment, Jordan. We all are. This sale happened so quickly, and the numbers involved are so astronomical, and you've been under so much stress. We just want to make sure you're making decisions for the right reasons and not being taken advantage of by people who see you as a means to their own enrichment. The careful wording, the subtle implications that I was somehow a victim who needed protection, the complete unwillingness to acknowledge that their actions were causing the harm they claimed to be preventing. I felt the last thread of hope snap cleanly. You signed legal documents accusing me of fraud, I said, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will. You provided testimony that will be used to destroy my reputation and harm people who depend on this company for their livelihoods. That's not concern. That's sabotage. And tomorrow in court I'm going to prove it. My mother's response was almost sad in its predictability. You're upset and I understand that. But this will all work out for the best. Sometimes we need outside intervention to see situations clearly. Why don't you come over this weekend after everything settles down, and we can talk about next steps for the company. Maybe Victoria and Derek can help you restructure in a way that's more sustainable. The presumption that I would need their help, that this was all some elaborate intervention for my own good, that we'd all just move forward as if nothing significant had happened, was so disconnected from reality that I couldn't formulate a response. I ended the call without saying goodbye and sat in my apartment staring at my phone. The family I'd been born into, the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally, had chosen sides against me based on nothing but Victoria's jealousy and their own inability to accept that I'd succeeded beyond their expectations. There was no misunderstanding to clear up, no middle ground to find. There was just the clear fact of their betrayal and the equally clear necessity of my response. Tomorrow in court I would defend myself with every weapon I had. And after that, I would decide what it meant to be an orphan by choice rather than circumstance. Wednesday morning broke cold and clear. The kind of sharp autumn weather that made everything feel hyperreal and slightly fragile. I dressed in a charcoal suit that I'd bought for investor presentations, conservative enough for court but cut in a way that made me feel competent rather than apologetic. My grandmother's watch was warm against my wrist from body heat, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward whether I was ready or not. I met Marcus at the Multnomah County Courthouse at 1:30, and we spent the 30 minutes before our hearing reviewing key points and anticipated arguments. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal in a way that felt like it belonged to an earlier century. Victoria was already seated at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a sharp-faced man in his 50s who had a reputation for aggressive litigation. She dressed carefully too, in a navy dress that projected professional concern, and she didn't meet my eyes when I entered. Derek wasn't present, which made sense given that his criminal activity was likely to come up during proceedings. My parents sat in the gallery behind Victoria, my mother's hands folded in her lap in an attitude of patient waiting, my father's expression stern and judgmental. Judge Holloway entered promptly at 2, and we all rose. She was in her early 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she peered over with the air of someone who'd heard every possible argument and wasn't impressed by most of them. The clerk called the case, and Victoria's attorney stood to present opening arguments. He painted a picture of a concerned sister who'd become aware of troubling information about financial misrepresentation, who tried to address the issue privately before reluctantly filing for judicial intervention to prevent harm to investors and other stakeholders. It was a smooth performance, hitting all the right notes of reluctance and civic duty, and I watched the judge's expression for any sign of how it was landing. She remained neutral, making occasional notes but giving nothing away. When Victoria's attorney finished and returned to his seat, Marcus stood and the entire energy in the room shifted. "May it please the court," he began, and then proceeded to systematically dismantle every accusation Victoria had made. He presented financial documentation showing that our accounting practices were not just legitimate but conservative. He submitted affidavits from external auditors confirming that they'd found no irregularities during their reviews. He provided excerpts from Titan-Edge's due diligence reports showing that their team had verified our representations independently. Then Marcus introduced the evidence that changed everything. "Your Honor, we've discovered that the petitioner's accusations are based on information obtained through unauthorized access to Nexus Analytics computer systems. With your permission, I'd like to present testimony from our IT security analyst and forensic specialist. Judge Holloway nodded, and Elliot was called to the stand. He walked through his findings clearly and methodically, explaining how he'd noticed unusual access patterns and what those patterns revealed about Derek Hammond's activities. Kimberly followed with her forensic analysis, presenting a timeline of Derek's unauthorized access and the files he'd exported. She explained in language a non-technical person could understand how Derek had exploited security vulnerabilities to escalate his privileges and reach sensitive information he had no legitimate reason to view. The evidence was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, timestamps and file names and export logs that told an unambiguous story of corporate espionage. I watched Victoria's expression crack as the presentation continued. Her attorney was making furious notes, clearly unprepared for this line of defense. When Kimberly finished her testimony, Judge Holloway removed her glasses and looked directly at Victoria. "Ms. Blake," she said, her voice carrying an edge that suggested her patience had limits. "Did you obtain the information underlying your petition from your husband? Did you know or have reason to believe that information was acquired through unauthorized access to computer systems?" Victoria's attorney tried to object, but Judge Holloway cut him off with a gesture. "This is a simple question that goes to the heart of the petition's validity. Ms. Blake, please answer." Victoria stood slowly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine fear in her face. She stammered something about relying on information that was shared with her, about not knowing the specific source, about having concerns that needed to be addressed regardless of how she became aware of them. Judge Holloway was unmoved. The court finds that this petition is based on information obtained through unauthorized and potentially criminal access to the respondent's business systems. Even setting aside the question of criminal liability, the information was stolen and therefore cannot form the basis for legitimate legal action. Furthermore, the court finds no credible evidence of fraud or misrepresentation in the respondent's business practices. The financial documentation presented today demonstrates appropriate accounting practices and adequate disclosure. The petition for temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction is denied in its entirety. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo long after the sound faded. Victoria's attorney was on his feet immediately, requesting a stay or an opportunity to present additional evidence, but Judge Holloway was already gathering her papers. "Counsel," she said without looking up, "I suggest you advise your client about the potential consequences of filing frivolous litigation and about her husband's exposure to criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This matter is closed." She left the bench, and the courtroom erupted into motion and noise. Marcus was shaking my hand and saying something about expected outcomes and strong evidence, but I was watching Victoria across the courtroom as reality settled over her like ash. Her attorney was speaking to her in low, urgent tones, probably explaining what Judge Holloway's comments about criminal liability actually meant, and I could see the exact moment comprehension replaced defiance in her expression. She'd gambled everything on this injunction succeeding, on creating enough chaos and doubt that the Titan Edge acquisition would collapse under its own uncertainty. Instead, she'd exposed herself and Derek to potential federal prosecution, lost decisively in a public forum, and accomplished nothing except proving that I was exactly who I'd always claimed to be. My parents remained seated in the gallery, frozen in their positions like they were waiting for someone to tell them what came next. I made myself walk past them without stopping, without acknowledging their presence, because anything I said in that moment would have been either devastating or meaningless, and I didn't have energy for either option. The courthouse hallway was bright with afternoon sun streaming through tall windows, and I stood there for a moment letting my eyes adjust while Marcus spoke with the clerk about filing additional motions. We needed to formally request that the court refer Derek's activities to federal prosecutors, and we needed to ensure that Victoria's failed petition became part of the permanent record in case she tried anything similar in the future. Elliot had followed us out of the courtroom, looking shell-shocked but quietly pleased. "Thank you," I told him and watched him process the weight of those words. "What you did took real courage. You saw something wrong and you documented it even when you weren't sure it would matter. That's exactly the kind of integrity this company needs." He nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak much, and I made a mental note to have a longer conversation with him later about recognition and advancement. People who demonstrate character during crisis deserve to be rewarded for it, and Elliot had potentially saved Nexus Analytics from destruction. My phone started buzzing before we even left the courthouse, messages and calls coming through in rapid succession as word spread about the hearing outcome. The first call was from James Fitzgerald, the lead board member who'd been with us since series of funding. "Jordan," he said when I answered, his voice carrying unmistakable relief. "I just heard from Marcus's office. I cannot tell you how glad I am that this nonsense got shut down quickly. The board stands behind you completely, and I've already reached out to Titan Edge to assure them that there are no legitimate concerns about the acquisition. We're going to get this deal closed and move forward like this interruption never happened." I thanked him and took 3 more calls with similar themes. Investors and advisors who'd been watching anxiously from the sidelines and were now eager to express their support and confidence. By the time Marcus and I reached his office to debrief and plan next steps, I had a phone full of messages that would have been gratifying if I wasn't so exhausted by the entire ordeal. We spent 2 hours going through the implications of the court's decision, what it meant for the Titan Edge timeline, and what actions we needed to take regarding Derek's criminal exposure. Marcus was already drafting a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office, complete with Kimberly's forensic report and documentation of the stolen files. The question of whether to pursue criminal charges against Derek was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Marcus laid out the options with his characteristic thoroughness, explaining that we could either make a formal criminal referral and let federal prosecutors decide whether to bring charges, or we could use the threat of criminal prosecution as leverage to ensure Victoria and Derek never interfered with Nexus Analytics again. The choice would send different messages and achieve different outcomes, and I needed to think carefully about what I actually wanted beyond the immediate satisfaction of seeing them punished. Part of me wanted to watch Derek get arrested and perp-walked in front of cameras, wanted him to experience even a fraction of the fear and humiliation he tried to inflict on me. But another part recognized that pursuing maximum punishment would keep me tethered to this conflict for months or years, as the case wound through the justice system. I'd have to give depositions and testimony, relive the betrayal over and over, watch my family drama play out in public filings and court documents. The prospect was exhausting even to contemplate, and I found myself questioning whether revenge was worth that cost. I told Marcus I needed time to think about it, and he accepted that with a nod that suggested he'd expected the answer. "These decisions shouldn't be made in the immediate aftermath of winning," he said. "Take a few days, see how you feel once the adrenaline wears off. We can always file the criminal referral later if that's what you decide you want. In the meantime, I'm going to send a very strongly worded letter to Victoria and Derek's attorney, making clear that any future interference with Nexus Analytics or its business relationships will result in immediate criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Sometimes the threat is enough." I left Marcus's office as the sun was setting over downtown Portland, painting the buildings in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if I had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. Instead, I felt hollowed out and strange, like I'd been running on emergency reserves for so long that I'd forgotten what normal energy felt like. The acquisition was safe, the company was vindicated, and my family had been publicly exposed as the architects of their own humiliation. Those were victories by any objective measure, but they didn't feel triumphant. They just felt necessary and sad and final. I drove home through evening traffic, past restaurants with outdoor seating where people laughed over drinks and couples walked dogs, and the ordinary rhythms of life continued unchanged. My loft felt different when I walked in, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't consciously registered carrying. The dining table was still covered with legal documents and evidence binders, a reminder of the weekend I'd spent building my defense, but I didn't have the energy to clean it up tonight. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables, poured a glass of wine I didn't really want, and sat by the window watching the city lights emerge as darkness settled. My phone rang around 8, and I almost didn't answer when I saw my mother's name on the screen. But curiosity, or maybe just a desire for closure, made me pick up, and her voice came through tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Jordan, we need to talk about what happened today. You humiliated your sister in court. You made us all look terrible in front of a judge and whoever else was watching. This was supposed to stay private, supposed to be handled within the family, and instead you turned it into a public spectacle." The audacity of the accusation took my breath away for a moment. I humiliated Victoria, I said slowly, letting each word carry its full weight. Not the other way around. She filed a lawsuit based on stolen information. She accused me of fraud in public court documents. She tried to destroy my company and my reputation. I defended myself with facts and evidence. If she's humiliated, it's because her lies got exposed, not because I did anything wrong. My mother made a sound that might have been disagreement or distress. You could have handled this differently, she insisted. You could have talked to us, worked something out privately. Instead, you brought in lawyers and investigators and made everything adversarial. Victoria was just trying to look out for you, trying to make sure you weren't getting taken advantage of, and you responded by threatening her husband with prison. That's not how family treats each other, Jordan. The word family hung in the air between us, and I felt something click into place with the finality of a lock engaging. Family, I repeated. Is that what you think this is? Because families don't file fraudulent lawsuits against each other. They don't steal proprietary information through criminal hacking. They don't provide false testimony designed to destroy someone's livelihood. Victoria stopped being my family the moment she decided to sabotage me, and you stopped being my parents the moment you helped her do it. So let's not pretend this is about family loyalty or private handling of conflicts. This is about you choosing her over me, and now dealing with the consequences of that choice. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I wondered if my mother was processing what I'd said, or just waiting for me to apologize and back down like I probably would have done 6 months ago. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone cold in a way I'd rarely heard. You're being dramatic and ungrateful, she said. After everything we've done for you, all the support we've given over the years, this is how you respond to legitimate concerns? Fine. If you want to cut ties with your family over a business deal, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when things fall apart, and you realize you burned bridges you can't rebuild. I ended the call without responding because there was nothing left to say. The bridges were already ashes, had been burning since long before I recognized the smoke. My mother's parting shot about things falling apart would have landed differently a week ago, would have triggered my old fears about being fundamentally inadequate and destined to fail. But I'd spent the past several days proving my competence in the most rigorous way possible, defending myself against coordinated attacks from multiple directions, and emerging with my integrity intact. If that wasn't evidence of capability, then nothing would ever be enough, and I was done trying to meet impossible standards set by people who'd never believed in me anyway. The next morning I woke up early out of habit, my body still running on crisis time even though the immediate emergency had passed. The Portland sunrise was doing its thing outside my windows, all soft grays giving way to pale gold, and I made coffee in the quiet apartment while checking email and messages. Titan Edge's legal team had sent a note overnight confirming that they were comfortable proceeding with the acquisition on the original timeline, pending final due diligence updates and standard closing procedures. James Fitzgerald had forwarded the message with 3 exclamation points and a note reading, "We're back on track," and I felt a flicker of something that might have been excitement if I hadn't been so exhausted. The team at Nexus Analytics deserved to hear the good news directly from me. So I drove into the office earlier than usual and sent out a message asking everyone to gather in the main conference room at 9. They filtered in with cautious expressions, still uncertain about what the court outcome actually meant for their futures, and I stood at the front of the room feeling the weight of leadership in a way that was both familiar and newly significant. Yesterday we won a complete victory in court, I told them. The injunction was denied, the judge found no evidence of wrongdoing, and Titan Edge has confirmed they're moving forward with the acquisition. We're going to close this deal on schedule, and everyone in this room is going to benefit from the outcome you all helped create. The relief was visible and immediate, tension draining from faces and shoulders as people processed that their jobs were secure, and their stock options were going to pay out. Someone started clapping and it spread through the room until everyone was applauding, and I had to blink hard against the sudden sting in my eyes. These people had trusted me through uncertainty and chaos, had kept working and believing even when the news was full of fraud accusations and legal drama, and they deserved every bit of success that was coming their way. I answered questions for another 30 minutes, explaining what the next few weeks would look like as we moved toward closing, and what would change once Titan Edge formally acquired us. After the meeting dispersed, I pulled Elliot aside and told him I was promoting him to senior security analyst with a significant raise and expanded responsibilities. His work identifying the breach had potentially saved the company, and that kind of initiative needed to be recognized in concrete terms. He looked stunned and grateful, stammering something about just doing his job, and I reminded him that excellence always looked like just doing the job until someone bothered to notice the difference between adequate and exceptional. I made similar stops to thank other team members who'd gone above and beyond during the crisis, people who'd worked late to prepare documentation, or who'd held things together when I was distracted by legal battles. By midday, I was back in my office working through the backlog of operational issues that had accumulated while my attention was elsewhere. Client contracts needed review. Hiring decisions required input. Product development timelines had to be assessed and adjusted. The normal work of running a company felt almost meditative after the intensity of the past week, and I lost myself in spreadsheets and strategy documents until Marcus called around 3 to discuss next steps regarding Victoria and Derek. I'd been thinking about his question regarding criminal prosecution, turning it over in my mind during the quiet moments between tasks, and I'd reached a decision that felt right even if it wasn't fully satisfying. I want to file the criminal referral, I told Marcus. Not because I need to see Derek in prison, but because what he did was actually criminal and there should be consequences for that. Other companies need to know that this kind of corporate espionage will be prosecuted, and Derek needs to understand that betraying trust has real costs. But I don't want to be vindictive about it. If the U.S. attorney decides not to bring charges or offer some kind of plea deal, I'm okay with that. I just need there to be a record that we took this seriously and reported it appropriately. Marcus approved of the approach, noting that it struck the right balance between accountability and moving forward. He'd already drafted most of the referral documentation and just needed my approval to file it with the federal prosecutor's office. I gave him the green light and felt something settle in my chest, a sense that I'd handled the situation with the right combination of strength and restraint. Victoria and Derek would have to live with the uncertainty of potential criminal charges hanging over them, would have to hire expensive attorneys and explain to friends and colleagues what had happened, but I wouldn't have to invest emotional energy in pursuing maximum punishment. The justice system would take it from here, and I could focus on building rather than fighting. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of closing procedures and transition planning. Titan Edge sent teams to Portland to begin integration discussions, talking through how Nexus Analytics would operate as a subsidiary and what resources we'd need to scale our platform nationally. The conversations were energizing in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, reminding me why I'd been excited about the acquisition in the first place. We weren't just getting a payout, we were getting the infrastructure and support to achieve our original mission of improving healthcare outcomes through better data analysis. The 37 employees who'd stuck with me through crisis were going to have opportunities to do meaningful work at scale, and that mattered more than the money ever could. Victoria's name came up exactly once during those 2 weeks, when Marcus forwarded me a letter from her attorney requesting that we not pursue criminal charges against Derek. The letter was carefully worded to avoid anything that might constitute an admission of wrongdoing, but the subtext was clear. They were scared and hoping for mercy they hadn't shown me. Marcus asked how I wanted to respond, and I told him to send a brief note acknowledging receipt but making no commitments. The U.S. Attorney's Office would make their own determination about prosecution, and it wasn't my place to interfere with that process one way or another. My parents didn't contact me again after that phone call the night of the court hearing. I'd expected anger or continued attempts to make me feel guilty, but the silence was somehow worse, a confirmation that they'd written me off as easily as if I'd never existed. I found myself thinking about my grandmother during those quiet moments, about how she'd valued consistency and integrity above almost everything else. She would have been horrified by what Victoria and my parents had done, but she also would have expected me to handle the situation with dignity rather than descending to their level. I hoped I'd managed that balance, hoped she would have been proud of how I'd defended myself without losing sight of what actually mattered. The acquisition closed on July 15th exactly as scheduled, a Tuesday afternoon made unremarkable by the mundane reality of signing digital documents and watching wire transfers confirm in bank accounts. There was no champagne toast or celebration party, just a video call with Titan Edge's executive team welcoming Nexus Analytics into the corporate family and outlining next steps for integration. The $200 million valuation that had seemed so impossible months ago was now just a number in accounting ledgers, Real but somehow less significant than the fact that our software would reach thousands more hospitals and potentially save countless lives through earlier intervention in critical care situations. I bought myself dinner that night at a nice restaurant overlooking the river, sitting alone at a table for two because I wanted to mark the occasion somehow even if I didn't feel particularly celebratory. The waiter asked if I was waiting for someone and I said no, just me tonight, and he nodded with the professional neutrality of someone who'd seen every variety of solo diner. I ordered the salmon and a glass of wine that cost more than I would normally spend, and I sat watching boats move up and down the Willamette while thinking about what came next. The immediate future was clear enough. I'd stay on as CEO of Nexus Analytics for at least 2 years per my employment agreement with Titan Edge, continuing to lead the company I'd built, while leveraging their resources for expansion. The team would grow, probably doubling in size over the next 18 months as we scaled operations. There would be new challenges around maintaining culture and managing integration, problems that were luxurious compared to fighting for survival but real nonetheless. I was looking forward to those challenges, to the opportunity to focus on building rather than defending, to work that mattered for reasons beyond proving my competence to people who'd never believe anyway. The longer-term future was hazier and somehow more interesting. After my employment agreement ended, I'd have both financial resources and credibility to pursue whatever came next. Maybe another startup addressing a different problem in healthcare or education. Maybe advisory work helping other founders navigate the gap between good idea and sustainable business. Maybe something completely different that I hadn't imagined yet. The possibilities felt wide open in a way they hadn't since I was 22, and just starting to figure out who I wanted to become. What I knew for certain was that I was done living my life in relation to my family's expectations or limitations. I'd spent 31 years trying to earn approval from people who decided long ago that Victoria was the successful daughter, and I was the supporting character in their family story. That narrative had never been true, but I'd internalized it enough that proving them wrong had felt desperately important. Now, after everything that had happened, I understood that their opinions of me had never been based on my actual capabilities or achievements. They were based on their own need to maintain a certain family hierarchy, and no amount of success on my part was going to change that dynamic. So I was letting it go, releasing them from the role I'd cast them in as eventual validators of my worth. They would never be proud of me in the uncomplicated way I'd wanted, would never celebrate my successes without qualification or comparison to Victoria. That was a limitation in them, not a deficiency in me, and I was done contorting myself trying to overcome it. The freedom in that realization was dizzying and a little terrifying, like standing at the edge of something vast with no map to guide me forward. My grandmother's watch showed 8:30, time passing in its steady mechanical rhythm, regardless of human drama or family dysfunction. I paid my bill and walked out into the warm July evening, the city alive with people enjoying summer weather and their own private celebrations or sorrows. My phone buzzed with a text from James Fitzgerald congratulating me again on the acquisition closing and suggesting we grab coffee next week to discuss board governance going forward. Another message came from Elliot asking a technical question about our security protocols, the kind of detail-oriented inquiry that made me glad I'd promoted him. I walked along the waterfront for a while, past couples taking selfies and families with small children feeding ducks, and thought about the picnic that was supposed to happen 6 weeks ago at Willow Creek Park. I'd imagined that gathering as a chance for reconciliation and recognition, a moment when my family would finally see me as I actually was rather than who they'd decided I should be. The fantasy had been so vivid that I'd baked a pie and rehearsed gracious responses to anticipated congratulations. Now I understood that the picnic would have been just another performance in a play I'd been cast in without ever agreeing to the role. The real celebration, if that's what this was, looked nothing like what I'd imagined. No family gathering, no speeches or toasts, just me walking alone beside a river in a city I'd chosen, thinking about work that mattered and people who'd earned my trust through action rather than biology. It wasn't the ending I would have written if someone had asked me what I wanted, but it was honest in ways that my imagined reconciliation never could have been. And maybe that was enough, maybe that was actually better than the alternative. I made it back to my car as the light faded from the sky and the city lights started their nightly emergence. Tomorrow I'd go into the office and start the real work of integrating with Titan Edge, navigating the complexities of being a subsidiary, while maintaining the culture and mission that had defined Nexus Analytics from the beginning. There would be difficult conversations and unexpected obstacles and moments when I questioned whether we'd made the right choice in selling. But those were problems I wanted to have, challenges that came from success rather than survival, and I was ready for them. The drive home took me past the street where my parents lived, and I didn't turn my head to look at their house as I passed. There was no bitterness in the avoidance, just recognition that some chapters close permanently and trying to reopen them only causes damage. Victoria could have her role as the golden child in a family that would never know the truth about what she'd done or why. My parents could maintain whatever narrative helped them sleep at night about why one daughter had thrived while the other had tried to destroy her. None of it was my responsibility anymore. My phone rang one more time as I was parking in my building's garage, and this time it was Marcus with news about the U.S. Attorney's decision. They're moving forward with charges against Derek, he said. Criminal access to a protected computer, theft of trade secrets, wire fraud. He'll likely get a plea deal that involves probation and restitution rather than significant prison time, but he'll have a federal conviction on his record. Victoria isn't being charged directly, since they can't prove she knew the information was obtained illegally, though everyone involved understands she was complicit. I thanked Marcus for the update and sat in my car for a moment after ending the call. Justice was messy and incomplete, more bureaucratic than satisfying, but it would have to be enough. Derek would face consequences that were real if not devastating, and Victoria would have to live knowing that her scheme had failed completely while damaging her husband's future. They'd both learned that actions have costs, even if the price wasn't as steep as what they'd tried to inflict on me. Inside my apartment, I finally cleared the dining table of all the legal documents and evidence binders that had accumulated over the past weeks. I packed them into boxes and stored them in a closet, artifacts of a battle I'd won but didn't need to relive. The table looked strange when it was empty, larger than I remembered, and I found myself thinking about what I might put there instead. Maybe a puzzle or a craft project, something purely recreational that had nothing to do with defending myself or proving my worth. Maybe just flowers in a vase, beauty for its own sake without any strategic purpose. The strawberry pie I'd made for the picnic was long gone, thrown away when it became clear the gathering would never happen. But I still had the recipe, my grandmother's handwriting on a card that had survived decades of kitchen use and random relocations. Maybe I'd make it again someday for people who actually appreciated the gesture, friends who understood that homemade pie was an act of care, rather than a peace offering in hostile territory. Or maybe I'd never make it again and that would be fine too. One more tradition released along with everything else I'd inherited from a family that existed more in my imagination than in reality. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window looking out at the city, my city, the place I'd chosen to build something meaningful on my own terms. 37 people had jobs because I'd taken risks and made good decisions. Thousands of patients would receive better care because the software we developed would reach more hospitals. Those were accomplishments that mattered in ways that transcended family approval or personal validation. They were contributions to the world that would outlast any individual grievance or disappointment. My grandmother's watch showed 10:15, and I decided it was late enough to justify going to bed even though I wasn't particularly tired. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, integration meetings and product decisions, and the ongoing work of leadership. But tonight was just for rest, for letting my body and mind recover from weeks of sustained crisis. I changed into comfortable clothes and brushed my teeth and set an alarm for 6:30 because some habits were too ingrained to break even when circumstances had fundamentally changed. Before turning off the lights, I sent one final email to the Nexus Analytics team, thanking them again for their loyalty and hard work during difficult circumstances. I told them I was proud to lead people with such integrity and dedication, and I meant every word. They'd earned their success through talent and perseverance, and they'd chosen to stay with the company even when staying was risky. That kind of commitment deserved recognition, and I made a note to ensure the integration with Titan Edge included retention bonuses and advancement opportunities for everyone who'd stuck around when others might have fled. Sleep came easier than I expected, my body finally believing that the emergency had passed and normal function could resume. I dreamed about building something, though the details faded as soon as I woke. Just the sense of constructing piece by piece, of seeing something take shape under my hands, of knowing that I had both the skill and the right to create whatever I envisioned. When morning came with its usual golden light and the sounds of the city waking up, I felt ready for whatever came next. The acquisition was complete. The company was secure. My family's attempt to destroy me had failed so comprehensively that it served as its own kind of justice. And I was free in ways I'd never been before, untethered from expectations that had never fit and obligations that had only ever flowed in one direction. The future was uncertain but entirely mine to shape, and that was exactly how I wanted it. 6 months after the acquisition closed, I stood in front of a different kind of audience at a healthcare technology conference in Seattle. The invitation had come through Titan Edge's communications team, asking if I'd be willing to speak about building scalable solutions in clinical analytics. I'd hesitated at first, uncertain about becoming the public face of a story that still felt raw in some places, but eventually agreed because the work itself deserved attention regardless of my personal discomfort with visibility. The auditorium held maybe 300 people, hospital administrators and IT directors and healthcare consultants who'd gathered to learn about emerging technologies. I walked them through Nexus Analytics' evolution from startup to acquisition, focusing on the technical challenges we'd solved and the measurable improvements we documented in patient outcomes. I didn't mention the lawsuit or my family or any of the personal drama that had threatened to derail everything. That wasn't relevant to the audience, and it wasn't the story I wanted to tell anymore. What mattered was that we built something that worked, something that made healthcare delivery more effective and potentially saved lives through earlier intervention. During the question and answer session, a woman in the third row asked how I'd maintain focus during periods of extreme uncertainty. It was a diplomatic way of referencing the very public legal battle that anyone who'd followed tech news would remember from the summer. I appreciated her tact even as I recognized the impossibility of completely avoiding the topic. I kept my answer general, talking about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who believe in the mission rather than just the outcome, about how purpose can sustain you when circumstances become difficult. The audience nodded and someone else asked a technical question about our data integration protocols, moving us back to safer territory. After the session ended, several attendees approached with business cards and follow-up questions. One of them was a hospital CEO from Phoenix who wanted to discuss implementing our platform in their system. Another was a venture capitalist looking for promising healthcare startups to advise now that my operational responsibilities were settling into routine. I collected their information and promised to follow up, feeling the strange satisfaction of being sought after for my expertise rather than having to convince people I knew what I was talking about. The shift was subtle but significant, a change in how the world perceived me that reflected the internal transformation I'd undergone. That evening I had dinner with James Fitzgerald, who'd flown up from Portland for the conference. We sat in a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay and talked about the integration progress, about staffing challenges and product roadmap decisions, and the thousands of small details that defined corporate life. James had been a steady presence throughout the crisis and its aftermath, never wavering in his support even when the situation looked dire. I valued his counsel in ways that went beyond his official board role, appreciated his ability to separate business judgment from personal drama. Near the end of the meal, he asked about my family in the careful way people do when they know the topic is complicated. I haven't spoken to them since the court hearing, I told him honestly. My parents made their choice and I made mine. There's nothing left to say that would change anything. James nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the finality of that statement. He was older than me by almost 20 years, with grown children and a long marriage, and I wondered if he found my willingness to sever family ties troubling or admirable. What he said surprised me. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is recognize when a relationship is fundamentally toxic and remove yourself from it. Family gets this special exemption in our culture, like blood relation means you owe people unlimited chances to hurt you. But that's not actually true. You're allowed to protect yourself even from family, especially from family if they're the ones causing the harm. His matter-of-fact delivery made the permission feel real rather than theoretical, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tense. The flight back to Portland the next morning was smooth and uneventful, the kind of travel experience that passes without creating memories. I used the time to catch up on email and review documents for upcoming meetings, falling back into the comfortable rhythms of work that structured my days. The city looked beautiful from the air as we descended, the rivers and bridges and green spaces arranged in patterns that had become deeply familiar over the years I'd lived there. This was home in ways that had nothing to do with where I'd grown up or where my family lived, and I felt grateful for the distance between my past and my present. At the office on Monday, I had a one-on-one meeting with Elliot to discuss a security proposal he'd been developing. His confidence had grown enormously over the past months, his natural talent emerging now that he understood his observations were valued and taken seriously. We talked through his recommendations for enhancing our access controls and monitoring systems, and I approved the budget he'd requested for implementation. Watching him present his ideas with clarity and conviction reminded me why investing in people always generated better returns than any financial instrument could match. Later that week, I received a certified letter at my apartment that I almost didn't open. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize, and my first instinct was that Victoria had found some new angle of attack. But curiosity won out over caution, and I slid my finger under the envelope flap to reveal a single-page document. It was a notice that Derek Hammond had been sentenced to 18 months probation and ordered to pay restitution of $75,000 for his unauthorized access to Nexus Analytics systems. The criminal conviction was now part of the permanent public record, a consequence that would follow him through background checks and professional licensing for the rest of his life. I read the notice twice, trying to assess how I felt about the outcome. There was no satisfaction in Derek's punishment, no sense of victory or vindication. Just a tired acknowledgement that justice had processed another case and arrived at a resolution that probably satisfied no one completely. Derek would serve no jail time but would carry a federal conviction forever. Victoria faced no legal consequences but had to live with the knowledge that her scheme had accomplished nothing except damaging her husband's future. My parents presumably believed they'd done the right thing supporting Victoria, maintaining whatever narrative let them sleep at night. And I had moved forward with my life, building and creating and choosing to define myself by what I made rather than what had been done to me. I filed the sentencing notice in the box with all the other legal documents from that period and didn't think about it again. There were more important things demanding my attention, opportunities and challenges that actually mattered for the future, rather than dwelling on a past that was already resolved. Titan Edge had approved funding for a new research initiative exploring predictive models for sepsis identification, work that could potentially save thousands of lives annually if we got the algorithms right. That was worth my time and energy in ways that maintaining anger or seeking additional revenge never would be. Summer turned to fall and then winter, the seasons marking time with rain and occasional snow, and the particular quality of light that made Portland beautiful even in its grayest months. I celebrated my 32nd birthday quietly with friends from the company, people who'd become chosen family in the absence of biological relatives who understood me. We went to a comedy show and had drinks afterward, laughing about work absurdities and relationship dramas and the universal human comedy of trying to figure out how to be adults. Nobody mentioned the acquisition or the lawsuit or asked probing questions about my estranged family. They just treated me like a regular person, which was exactly what I needed. The holidays were easier than I'd anticipated. I dreaded the approach of Thanksgiving and Christmas, knowing they would highlight the absence of family traditions and raise questions about where I'd be spending the time. But when the days actually arrived, I found myself grateful for the freedom to create new traditions rather than performing in old ones that had never quite fit. Thanksgiving was a potluck with friends, everyone bringing dishes and telling stories and playing board games late into the night. Christmas was volunteering at a shelter in the morning, followed by a quiet afternoon reading books I'd been meaning to get to for months. Both days felt more authentic than any holiday gathering with my parents had ever been, free from the undercurrent of judgment and comparison that had always made those events feel like tests I was perpetually failing. In January, I got an unexpected email from a reporter at a business publication, asking if I'd be willing to be interviewed for a feature about women founders in tech. My first instinct was to decline, to maintain the privacy I'd carefully constructed around my personal life. But the reporter emphasized that she wanted to focus on the work itself, on the challenges of building a healthcare technology company, and the technical problems we'd solved. She mentioned that she'd lost a family member to a condition that might have been caught earlier with better data analysis, and that made Nexus Analytics' mission personally meaningful to her. I agreed to the interview with the understanding that my family situation was off-limits. We met at a coffee shop near the office and talked for over 2 hours about enterprise software development, about the difficulties of selling to hospitals with their complex decision-making processes, about the satisfaction of seeing your product make measurable differences in patient outcomes. The reporter was smart and well-prepared, asking questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of both the technology and the healthcare landscape. When the article came out 3 weeks later, it was everything I'd hoped for. A thoughtful examination of the work without any sensationalism about the personal drama. The piece generated interest from other publications and conference organizers, invitations to speak and consult that I selectively accepted based on whether they aligned with missions I cared about. I was learning to leverage the platform that success had created, to use visibility strategically rather than treating it as something to be avoided. My grandmother would have approved, I thought. She'd believed in showing up and doing the work and letting the results speak for themselves, which was exactly what I was trying to do now that I had the confidence in standing to do it effectively. Spring brought new growth, both literal in the form of cherry blossoms throughout the city and metaphorical in the expansion of Nexus Analytics under Titan Edge's ownership. We were hiring aggressively, bringing on talent from across the country who wanted to work on healthcare problems that mattered. The office culture was evolving, becoming more structured and professional as we grew, but we'd managed to maintain the core values that had defined us from the beginning. People still cared about the mission, still pushed back when they disagreed with decisions, still took ownership of their work in ways that made leadership feel less like management and more like coordination. I'd been thinking lately about what came after my employment agreement ended, about whether I wanted to stay with Nexus Analytics indefinitely or move on to new challenges. The work was meaningful and I enjoyed the team, but I also felt the pull of starting fresh, of taking everything I'd learned and applying it to different problems. There was no urgency to the decision, but I'd started having conversations with mentors and advisors about what different paths might look like, what opportunities existed for someone with my experience and resources. One possibility that kept surfacing was starting a fund to invest in other founders building healthcare technology companies. I'd learned so much through building Nexus Analytics, made every possible mistake and figured out how to recover from most of them, and that knowledge could be valuable to people earlier in their journeys. The idea of helping other founders avoid the pitfalls I'd encountered, or at least navigate them more effectively, had real appeal. It would be a way of multiplying impact beyond what any single company could achieve, of creating a portfolio of solutions to different healthcare challenges, rather than focusing all my energy on one problem. I mentioned the idea to James over lunch one day, and he immediately saw the potential. "You'd be excellent at that," he said. "You understand both the technical and business sides, you've been through the full cycle from startup to exit, and you have credibility with both founders and institutional investors. Plus you actually care about the healthcare mission rather than just chasing returns, which matters for building a fund that attracts the right kind of companies." His enthusiasm was gratifying but also slightly overwhelming, making something that had been abstract speculation feel suddenly concrete and possible. The more I considered it, the more the path made sense. I could start small, investing personally in a few companies while building relationships and deal flow. If that went well, I could raise a formal fund and do it at scale. It would be challenging in entirely new ways, requiring skills I'd need to develop around evaluation and negotiation and portfolio management. But the core mission would still be improving healthcare outcomes, just through a different mechanism than building software myself. The prospect felt energizing in ways that continuing to run Nexus Analytics indefinitely didn't quite match, and I recognized that restlessness as a signal worth paying attention to. By early summer, I'd made the decision to transition out of the CEO role when my employment agreement ended the following year. I told the Titan Edge leadership first, giving them ample time to plan for succession and ensuring they understood my commitment to making the transition smooth rather than disruptive. They were disappointed but not surprised, and we quickly aligned on a process for identifying and onboarding my replacement. I'd stay involved as a board advisor, maintaining continuity while stepping back from day-to-day operations. Telling the Nexus Analytics team was harder, because these were people I'd worked alongside through crisis and triumph, people who'd trusted my leadership, even when circumstances were uncertain. I gathered everyone in the main conference room on a Thursday afternoon and explained my thinking, emphasizing that this wasn't about dissatisfaction with the company or the work. It was about recognizing that my skills and interests were pulling me toward something different, and that Nexus Analytics deserved a leader who was fully committed to the operational challenges ahead, rather than someone whose attention was increasingly focused elsewhere. The reaction was mixed. Sadness about my departure balanced with understanding that leadership transitions were natural and often healthy for organizations. Several people asked about my plans, and I sketched out the broad outlines of the healthcare investment fund I was contemplating. Watching their faces light up with recognition that this was the right next step, even if it meant losing me as their direct leader. Elliot raised his hand and asked if I'd consider investing in his idea for a cybersecurity company focused on healthcare providers, and the room laughed at his timing even as I told him seriously that I'd be happy to hear his pitch when the time was right. The year that followed was one of deliberate transition, gradually handing off responsibilities while helping to onboard the new CEO Titan Edge recruited from their executive ranks. She was impressive and experienced, with a background in healthcare operations that complemented the technical expertise within the team. I liked her immediately and felt confident that Nexus Analytics would continue thriving under her leadership. We spent months working together, me transferring institutional knowledge and relationships while she brought fresh perspectives on strategy and growth. My 33rd birthday came and went without much fanfare, just dinner with friends and a weekend hiking trip in the Columbia River Gorge. I'd grown comfortable with the shape my life had taken, the chosen family and meaningful work and freedom from toxic relationships that demanded constant emotional management. Sometimes I wondered about my parents in Victoria, whether they ever thought about what had happened or if they'd constructed narratives that let them be victims in their own version of events. But the wondering was abstract and brief, more curiosity than actual caring about the answers. On my last official day as CEO, the team threw a small party with cake and speeches, and a gift that made me tear up unexpectedly. They'd created a bound book containing notes from everyone at the company, reflections on what they'd learned from working with me, and what Nexus Analytics had meant for their careers and lives. I read through it that evening in my apartment, touched by the thoughtfulness and specificity of their comments. These were the relationships that mattered, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than biological accident and inherited obligation. The healthcare investment fund launched officially in September, with initial capital from my personal resources and commitments from several institutional investors who believed in the thesis. I'd spent months developing the investment framework and building relationships with accelerators and founder networks, positioning myself to see deal flow from promising early-stage companies. The work was exciting and terrifying in equal measure, a return to the uncertainty of building something new without clear roadmaps or guaranteed outcomes. My first investment was in a company developing AI-powered tools for emergency room triage, helping overwhelmed staff prioritize patients based on severity and likelihood of deterioration. The founders were brilliant and passionate, a husband-wife team who'd met during medical residency and seen firsthand the challenges their technology could address. I spent hours with them refining their pitch and business model, sharing lessons from my own experience about common mistakes and strategic choices that seemed small but compounded over time. Watching them incorporate the feedback and grow more confident in their vision felt remarkably fulfilling, a different flavor of impact than directly building had provided. By the end of the year, I'd made 4 investments and passed on dozens of other opportunities, developing a clearer sense of what I was looking for and what added value I could provide beyond just capital. The fund was small compared to the big players in healthcare venture capital, but it was mine in ways that Nexus Analytics never quite had been once Titan Edge acquired us. Every decision was mine to make, every success or failure a direct result of my judgment. The responsibility was exhilarating and occasionally overwhelming, exactly the kind of challenge I'd been craving. I thought sometimes about the person I'd been 2 years earlier, the one who'd baked a strawberry pie for a family picnic that never happened, who'd believed that professional success would be enough to earn parental approval and sisterly respect. That version of me felt impossibly naive now, though I tried to view her with compassion rather than judgment. She'd been doing her best with the understanding she had at the time, trying to navigate relationships that were fundamentally broken in ways she couldn't yet see. The fact that I'd survived the shattering of those illusions and built something real from the pieces was worth acknowledging, even celebrating in quiet, private ways. My grandmother's watch still kept perfect time on my wrist, its steady mechanical heartbeat a reminder of continuity and endurance. I'd had it serviced recently by a jeweler who specialized in vintage timepieces, ensuring it would keep running for decades to come. The jeweler had asked about its history and I told him about my grandmother, about her 40 years of teaching and her belief in showing up consistently and doing the work. He'd handled the watch with extra care after that, understanding that its value wasn't monetary but deeply personal. On New Year's Eve, I attended a party hosted by one of my portfolio companies, a celebration of their successful series of funding round and the year of growth ahead. The founders were younger than me by almost a decade, filled with the particular combination of confidence and terror that characterized people on the cusp of scaling rapidly. I remembered that feeling viscerally, the excitement of possibility mixed with the knowledge that you were one wrong decision away from catastrophic failure. But I also knew that they'd figure it out, that competence and persistence could overcome most obstacles if you refused to quit when things got difficult. As midnight approached and people gathered to count down the final seconds of the year, I found myself thinking about Victoria and my parents for the first time in months. Not with anger or resentment, but with a strange detached curiosity about their lives and whether they'd found the satisfaction they'd been seeking when they tried to destroy me. I hoped they had, in whatever way made sense to them, because carrying that much bitterness and jealousy seemed exhausting. But their happiness or lack thereof wasn't my responsibility anymore, wasn't something I needed to monitor or manage or feel guilty about. The countdown reached 0 and the room erupted in celebration. Strangers hugging and couples kissing and someone popping champagne that sprayed across the floor. I raised my glass with everyone else and felt genuinely hopeful about the year ahead, about the companies I'd helped build and the problems we'd solve together. This was the life I'd chosen after everything else had burned away, and it was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.